The volcanic sand of Iwo Jima trembled beneath the boots of Private First Class Johnny Martinez as he crouched in the landing craft, watching the island's black beaches grow larger through the morning mist. The sulfur smell hit him. First, a reminder that this 8-square-mile piece of hell was born from the Earth's molten core. Around him, fellow Marines from the 4th and 5th Marine Divisions clutched their rifles with white knuckles, their faces painted with the grim determination of men who knew they were sailing toward their destiny. 30 seconds, bellowed Sergeant Murphy O'Brien, his Irish accent cutting through the thunder of naval bombardment that had been pounding the island for 72 consecutive days. The pre-invasion barrage was the longest in Pacific War history. Yet as the landing craft doors dropped and the first wave of Marines charged onto the beaches, they would discover that the Japanese had survived it all, buried deep in their labyrinthine tunnel system. Lieutenant Colonel James Jimmy Roosevelt, son of the late President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, led his battalion of the 921st Marine Regiment toward the black sand. The beach was unlike anything the Marines had encountered in their island-hopping campaign. Not the white coral of Tarawa or the jungle-covered shores of Guadalcanal, but a moonscape of volcanic ash that swallowed their boots with each step. The fine, dark sand would prove to be an enemy almost as deadly as the Japanese defenders, making every movement exhausting and turning simple advances into Herculean efforts. As referenced in the extensive documentation compiled by the Marine Corps' Historical Division, the landing was initially met with an eerie silence that unnerved even the most battle-hardened veterans. Colonel Harry the Horse Liversedge, commanding the 28th Marines, had warned his men that the quiet was deceptive. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, the Japanese commander, had abandoned the traditional strategy of defending at the water's edge. Instead, he had constructed an underground fortress system with over 11 miles of tunnels, concrete bunkers, and hidden artillery positions that could rain death from multiple directions. The first Marines to reach the terraces beyond the beach found themselves in a nightmare of interlocking fields of fire. Machine gun nests, invisible from the sea, suddenly erupted with devastating accuracy. Mortar rounds began falling like deadly rain, and the distinctive crack of Japanese rifles echoed from positions that seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. The volcanic sand that had hindered their advance now became their salvation, as Marines dove for cover in shell craters and used the natural terrain to shield themselves from the withering fire. Captain Robert Bob Dunlap of the 27th Marines watched in horror as his company was cut down by enfilading fire from Mount Suribachi, the dormant volcano that dominated the southern end of the island. The mountain slopes were honeycombed with gun emplacements, and every cave mouth seemed to conceal another deadly surprise. The Japanese had turned the entire island into a fortress, with predetermined kill zones and escape routes that allowed defenders to appear, strike, and vanish like ghosts. By the end of the first day, the Marines had established a precarious foothold on the island, but at a terrible cost. The black sand was now stained with American blood, and the men who had survived the initial assault knew that this battle would be unlike any they had fought before. The island's defenders were not planning to retreat. They were prepared to die in place, taking as many Marines with them as possible. The second day dawned with the acrid smell of cordite and death hanging over the volcanic wasteland. Corporal Michael Mick O'Sullivan from Boston's South Side pressed his face against the black sand as Japanese mortars walked their deadly pattern across the beach. The Marines had learned that advancement on Iwo Jima was measured not in miles or even yards, but in feet. Precious, blood-soaked feet that cost them dearly for every inch gained. Sergeant First Class William Wild Bill Henderson of the 5th Marine Division led his squad through what the men had already begun calling the meat grinder, a hellish landscape of shattered volcanic rock, twisted metal, and the constant threat of death from above. Below, and all sides, the Japanese defenders had perfected the art of camouflage, turning every boulder, every depression in the terrain into a potential death trap. Henderson's squad had started the morning with 12 men. By noon, only 6 remained combat effective, the 28th Marines, under Colonel Liversedge's command. had been tasked with the seemingly impossible mission of capturing Mount Suribachi. The dormant volcano rose 546 feet above the island's southern tip, its slopes riddled with defensive positions that had been carved from the living rock. Every approach to the mountain was covered by interlocking fields of fire, and the Japanese had positioned observers in the crater who could direct accurate artillery fire on any marine movement across the island. Private First Class Anthony Tony Benedetto from the Bronx crawled forward with his flamethrower, the weapon's fuel tanks making him a priority target for Japanese snipers. The volcanic terrain provided excellent concealment for enemy marksmen who had spent months learning every sight line and firing position. Benedetto's job was to clear the pillboxes and bunkers that blocked the advance, but each use of his weapon revealed his position to enemy observers, who would immediately call down mortar fire on his location. As documented in the comprehensive battle reports maintained by the 3rd Marine Amphibious Corps, the Japanese defensive strategy was brutally effective. General Kuribayashi had abandoned the traditional banzai charges that had characterized previous Pacific battles, instead implementing a defense in depth that maximized casualties while preserving his forces. Every position was designed to be mutually supporting, with predetermined fields of fire that created killing zones impossible to traverse without massive casualties. The Marines adapted with the desperate creativity of men fighting for their lives. Corporal James "Jimmy" Rodriguez developed a technique of using satchel charges to collapse tunnel entrances, sealing Japanese defenders in their underground positions. Lieutenant Patricia "Pat" Thompson, one of the few female Marines serving in a combat zone, coordinated medical evacuations under fire, crawling through the volcanic sand to reach wounded Marines who couldn't be reached by conventional stretcher teams. The psychological toll was as devastating as the physical casualties. The island's supernatural landscape, with its sulfurous fumes and otherworldly terrain, seemed designed to break men's spirits. Marines reported hearing voices in the wind, seeing movement in the shadows of the volcanic rocks. The constant threat of death from hidden enemies created a paranoia that affected even the most seasoned veterans. By the end of the 3rd day, the Marines had advanced barely 500 yards from the landing beaches. The volcanic sand had become a repository of American blood and Japanese steel, littered with the debris of war and the personal effects of men who would never see home again. Yet despite the horrific casualties, the Marines continued to push forward, driven by a combination of duty, loyalty to their comrades, and the knowledge that retreat was not an option. The Japanese defenders fought with the desperation of men who knew they were doomed, cut off from resupply and reinforcement. They had accepted death as their fate and sought only to make the American victory as costly as possible. The stage was set for a battle that would test the limits of human endurance and redefine the meaning of courage under fire. The morning of February 23rd dawned gray and cold, with a bitter wind whipping across the volcanic landscape that had become synonymous with death and heroism. Sergeant Michael "Mike" Strank, a Czech immigrant who had found his calling in the Marine Corps, led his squad up the treacherous slopes of Mount Suribachi. The mountain had become a symbol of Japanese resistance, its peak shrouded in smoke and mystery, its slopes defended by men who had sworn to die rather than surrender. Corporal Harlan Block from Texas moved with the fluid grace of a natural athlete, his rifle held at the ready as he navigated the maze of volcanic rocks and hidden bunkers. The Marines had learned that every shadow could conceal a sniper. Every depression in the terrain might hide a spider hole from which death could emerge without warning. Block's squad had been chosen for this mission because of their proven ability to work together under the most extreme conditions. The ascent of Mount Suribachi was a testament to Marine ingenuity and courage. Private First Class Franklin "Frank" Sousley from Kentucky used his knowledge of mining techniques to identify and neutralize Japanese positions carved into the volcanic rock. The defenders had created a three-dimensional battlefield with positions above, below, and on the same level as the advancing Marines. Every step forward required careful coordination and the willingness to sacrifice individual safety for the success of the mission. Navy Corpsman John "Doc" Bradley moved among the Marines with quiet efficiency. His medical bag a symbol of hope in a landscape dominated by death. The volcanic sand made evacuation of wounded Marines extremely difficult, and Bradley often had to perform life-saving procedures under direct enemy fire. His presence gave the Marines the confidence to take risks they might otherwise have avoided, knowing that skilled medical help was only a shout away. As the Marines fought their way up the mountain, they encountered resistance that seemed to come from the very rocks themselves. Japanese defenders would emerge from concealed positions, engage the Marines with devastating fire, then disappear into the tunnel system before effective counterfire could be brought to bear. The volcanic terrain, which had initially seemed to favor the defenders, gradually began to work in favor of the Marines as they learned to use the natural cover to their advantage. Private First Class Ira Hayes, a Pima Indian from Arizona whose people had known warfare long before the white man arrived in America, used his traditional tracking skills to identify Japanese positions by subtle signs that other Marines might miss. Hayes had volunteered for the most dangerous assignments, driven by a desire to prove himself worthy of the uniform he wore and the flag he served. The breakthrough came when Sergeant Strank identified a weakness in the Japanese defensive line, a narrow ravine that provided concealed access to the mountain's upper slopes. The Marines moved through this natural corridor with painstaking care, knowing that discovery would mean certain death. The volcanic rock muffled sound, but it also concealed movement, allowing the small Marine patrol to approach the summit without detection. According to the detailed historical accounts preserved in the National Archives, the final assault on Mount Suribachi's peak was accomplished by a 40-man patrol that had been reduced to fewer than 20 effective fighters. The Japanese defenders, realizing that their position was about to be overrun, fought with the desperation of men who knew they were facing their final moments. Hand-to-hand combat was fierce and brutal, with both sides using whatever weapons came to hand. The moment when the American flag was raised on the summit of Mount Suribachi became one of the most iconic images in American military history. The flag itself was small and somewhat tattered, but it represented something far greater than its physical dimensions. To the Marines fighting and dying on the beaches below, it was a symbol that victory was possible, that their sacrifices had meaning, and that the American spirit could not be broken by enemy fire or adverse terrain. The photograph taken by Associated Press photographer Joe Rosenthal captured not just a moment in time, but the essence of American determination and sacrifice. The 6 Marines who raised the flag, Strank, Block, Sousley, Bradley, Hayes, and Corporal Rene Gagnon, became symbols of American heroism, though 3 of them would not survive the battle. To see how their image would inspire a nation, with Mount Suribachi secured, the Marines turned their attention to the northern 2/3 of the island, where General Kuribayashi had constructed his main defensive positions. The terrain here was even more challenging than the volcano's slopes, a nightmarish landscape of ridges, ravines, and rocky outcroppings that provided natural fortifications for the Japanese defenders. Each position had been carefully selected and prepared, with interlocking fields of fire that turned every advance into a deadly gamble. Major General Keller Howling Mad Rocky, commanding the 5th Marine Division, studied the terrain through his binoculars and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning wind. The Japanese had spent months preparing this killing ground, using forced Korean labor and Japanese engineering expertise to create a fortress that seemed impregnable. Every ridge line bristled with hidden gun emplacements, every valley was a potential death trap, and the entire area was connected by a tunnel system that allowed defenders to move unseen from position to position. Captain Daniel Den McCarthy of the 27th Marines led his company into what the men called the wilderness, a maze of volcanic rock formations that provided perfect concealment for Japanese snipers and machine gun nests. The going was slow and deadly, with each yard of advance costing Marines their lives. McCarthy's men had developed a grim joke about real estate prices on Iwo Jima. They were paying for every square foot with American blood. The Japanese defensive strategy in the northern sectors was based on the concept of defense in depth, with multiple lines of resistance that would force the Marines to fight for every position twice. After capturing a ridge or ravine, the Marines would find themselves under fire from positions they thought they had already cleared. The tunnel system allowed Japanese defenders to reoccupy positions behind the Marine advance, creating a constantly shifting battlefield where the front lines were impossible to define. Private First Class Eugene Gene Sledge from Alabama found himself in the middle of this tactical nightmare, fighting an enemy who seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. The volcanic terrain amplified sound in strange ways, making it difficult to determine the direction of enemy fire. Sledge learned to move by instinct, using the natural cover provided by the volcanic formations while staying alert for the subtle signs that might indicate a Japanese position. According to documentation preserved by the Marine Corps' Historical Center, the fighting in the northern sectors was characterized by small unit actions that often devolved into hand-to-hand combat. The terrain made coordination between units extremely difficult, and individual Marines often found themselves fighting alone or in small groups, cut off from their parent units and forced to make tactical decisions that would have been made by officers in conventional warfare. Corporal Lewis Lou Millett, a farm boy from Iowa who had enlisted after Pearl Harbor, discovered that his experience with explosive devices made him invaluable. In the underground war that was raging beneath the surface, the Japanese had created a subterranean city beneath the northern sectors, complete with command centers, ammunition storage areas, and living quarters that could house hundreds of defenders. Millett's job was to locate and destroy these facilities, often by crawling through narrow tunnels with explosive charges. While under fire from hidden defenders, the Marines adapted their tactics to meet the unique challenges of the northern sectors. Flamethrower teams worked in close coordination with riflemen to clear bunkers and caves, while engineers used demolition charges to collapse tunnel entrances and seal Japanese defenders in their underground positions. The fighting was intimate and brutal, with Marines often having to clear positions room by room, tunnel by tunnel. The psychological strain of this type of warfare was enormous. Marines reported feeling constantly watched, never knowing when or where the next attack would come. The volcanic terrain created an otherworldly environment that seemed designed to break men's spirits, with sulfurous fumes and strange rock formations that played tricks on the mind. Yet the Marines pressed forward, driven by loyalty to their comrades and the knowledge that every yard gained brought them closer to victory. The battle for the northern sectors would continue for 2 more weeks, with casualties mounting daily as the Marines fought their way through the most heavily defended terrain in the Pacific War. The Japanese defenders, knowing that defeat was inevitable, fought with the desperate courage of men who had accepted death as their fate and sought only to make the American victory as costly as possible. Beneath the volcanic surface of Iwo Jima, a different kind of warfare was being fought in the Stygian darkness of the Japanese tunnel system. Corporal Thomas Tommy Anderson from Detroit had volunteered for the most dangerous assignment. In the Marine Corps' tunnel warfare, armed with a pistol, a knife, and a few grenades, Anderson crawled through passages barely wide enough for a man's shoulders, never knowing what lay around the next corner. The Japanese had created an underground city that rivaled anything in military history. Miles of tunnels connected defensive positions, supply dumps, command centers, and living quarters that could house thousands of defenders. The volcanic rock was perfect for tunneling, hard enough to support excavation, but soft enough to be worked with hand tools. The result was a three-dimensional battlefield that confounded conventional military tactics. Lieutenant Colonel Justice Jumping Joe Chambers of the 25th Marines had been tasked with coordinating the underground assault. The Marines had learned that surface victories were meaningless if the tunnels remained intact. Japanese defenders would simply emerge from hidden entrances and reoccupy positions that had been declared secure. Chambers developed new tactics that combined surface advances with systematic tunnel clearance, but the cost in Marine lives was staggering. Private First Class Robert Bobby Leckie from New Jersey found himself in the nightmare world of underground combat, where death could come from any direction and the enemy was often invisible until the final moment. The tunnels were filled with traps and obstacles designed to channel attackers into kill zones, and the air was thick with curdite, sulfur, and the smell of death. Lecky learned to move by sound and instinct, using his other senses to navigate a world where vision was limited to the narrow beam of a flashlight. The Japanese defenders had prepared for this type of warfare with characteristic thoroughness. According to intelligence reports captured during the battle and preserved in the Marine Corps archives, General Kuribayashi had ordered the construction of multiple tunnel systems with built-in redundancy and escape routes. Each sector of the tunnel network could be sealed off and defended independently, creating a series of underground fortresses that had to be cleared individually. Sergeant Major William Bill Basiloni, veteran of Guadalcanal and holder of the Medal of Honor, led his men through the underground maze with the calm efficiency of a man who had faced death many times before. Basiloni had developed techniques for tunnel fighting that minimized casualties while maximizing effectiveness, but the nature of the fighting made heavy losses inevitable. Each tunnel had to be cleared step by step, with Marines advancing in the face of machine gun fire, grenade explosions, and the constant threat of collapse. The psychological impact of tunnel warfare was devastating. Marines reported feeling buried, alive, trapped in a world where the sky was invisible and the earth itself seemed to be their enemy. The volcanic rock transmitted sound in strange ways, creating echoes and reverberations that made it difficult to determine the location of enemy fire. The air was thick and hard to breathe, filled with dust and fumes that burned the lungs and clouded the mind. Marine engineers worked around the clock to map the tunnel system and identify critical nodes that could be destroyed to disrupt Japanese communications and supply lines. The work was painstaking and dangerous, with engineers often having to crawl through active combat zones to place demolition charges. The Japanese had anticipated this tactic and had created numerous false tunnels and dead ends designed to waste Marine time and resources. The breakthrough came when Marine intelligence officers, working with captured Japanese documents, identified the location of General Kuribayashi's command center. The underground complex was located in the northern sectors of the island, protected by multiple layers of defensive positions and accessible only through a maze of tunnels and chambers. The decision was made to assault the command center directly, using a combination of surface attacks and underground infiltration. The assault on the Japanese command center required the coordination of multiple Marine units, each with a specific role in the complex operation. Surface units would provide covering fire and prevent Japanese reinforcements from reaching the area, while tunnel teams would penetrate the underground complex and eliminate the command structure. The operation was scheduled for the early morning hours, when Japanese defenders would be least alert and Marine forces could take advantage of the element of surprise. The success of the underground war would determine the outcome of the entire battle. If the Marines could eliminate the Japanese command structure and destroy the tunnel system, organized resistance would collapse and the island would be secured. But if the assault failed, the Marines would face weeks of additional fighting in the underground maze, with casualties mounting daily and victory seeming increasingly distant. The pre-dawn darkness of March 15th was shattered by the coordinated assault on the Japanese command complex. Marine artillery, naval gunfire, and close air support converged on the target area with devastating precision, while underground assault teams moved through the tunnel system toward their objectives. The final phase of the Battle of Iwo Jima had begun, and both sides knew that the outcome would be decided in the next few hours. Major Robert Bob Dunlap led the surface assault team across the volcanic terrain toward the entrance to the Japanese command bunker. The landscape was a moonscape of shell craters and shattered rock, littered with the debris of 5 weeks of continuous combat. Dunlap's Marines moved with the fluid efficiency of men who had learned their trade in the most unforgiving school imaginable, combat against a determined enemy who preferred death to surrender. Beneath the surface, Corporal Anderson and his tunnel team crawled through the narrow passages toward the heart of the Japanese defensive system. The air was thick with smoke and dust, and the sound of explosions above ground created a constant rumble that threatened to collapse the tunnel walls. Anderson's team moved by feel and instinct, using hand signals and whispered commands to coordinate their movements in the Stygian darkness. The Japanese defenders, knowing that their final hour had come, fought with the desperation of men who had accepted death as their fate. General Kurebayashi had prepared his troops for this moment, instilling in them the samurai code that demanded death before dishonor. The final battle would be fought not for territory or strategic advantage, but for the honor of the emperor and the soul of Japan. Captain Patricia Thompson continued her medical work under impossible conditions, crawling through the volcanic sand to reach wounded Marines who couldn't be evacuated by conventional means. The casualty rate in the final assault was staggering, with Marine units suffering losses that would have broken less determined forces. Thompson's presence on the battlefield was a testament to the courage of the medical personnel who served alongside the combat troops. The breakthrough came when Corporal Anderson's tunnel team reached the Japanese command center and discovered that General Kurebayashi had already moved to a final defensive position in the northern caves. The command bunker was defended by a skeleton crew of Japanese soldiers who fought to the death. Rather than surrender, Anderson's team cleared the bunker room by room, using grenades and small arms fire to eliminate the defenders. Private First Class Martinez, who had survived the initial landing and 5 weeks of continuous combat, found himself in the final assault on the Japanese cave system. The caves were natural formations in the volcanic rock, enlarged and fortified by the Japanese defenders. Each cave had to be cleared individually, with Marines using flamethrowers and demolition charges to eliminate the defenders. The work was slow and dangerous, with casualties mounting as the Marines worked their way through the maze of caves and passages. As documented in the official Marine Corps' history of the battle, the final Japanese resistance was centered around a series of caves in the northern sector of the island. General Kurebayashi had chosen this location for his final stand, knowing that the terrain would maximize the effectiveness of his remaining forces. The caves provided natural protection from Marine artillery and air attacks, while the narrow entrances created choke points that could be defended by small numbers of determined soldiers. The psychological impact of the final assault was profound. Marines who had survived 5 weeks of combat found themselves facing an enemy who seemed to become more determined as defeat became inevitable. The Japanese defenders fought with a fanaticism that was difficult for American troops to understand, preferring death to surrender and continuing to resist even when their position was hopeless. The end came suddenly and violently. On the morning of March 25th, Marine patrols discovered the body of General Kurebayashi in one of the northern caves, along with the remnants of his staff. The Japanese commander had committed suicide rather than face capture, following the samurai code that had guided his defense of the island. With their leader dead and their defensive system destroyed, organized Japanese resistance collapsed. The Battle of Iwo Jima was over, but the cost had been enormous. The Marines had suffered casualties that would haunt the Corps for generations, while the Japanese garrison had been virtually annihilated. The black volcanic sand of the island had been purchased with American blood and Japanese steel, creating a monument to the courage and sacrifice of men who had faced death in the most unforgiving environment imaginable. The silence that settled over Iwo Jima on the morning of March 26th was more unsettling than the thunder of artillery that had dominated the island for 36 days. Private First Class Martinez stood among the volcanic rocks near the northern caves, his rifle held loosely in hands that still trembled from the intensity of the final assault. Around him, the landscape bore the scars of one of the most brutal battles in Marine Corps' history, a moonscape of craters, shattered equipment, and the personal effects of men who would never return home. The final casualty count would not be known for days, but the Marines who had survived could see the cost written in the faces of their comrades. Of the 70,000 Marines who had landed on the black beaches of Iwo Jima, nearly 27,000 had become casualties. The Japanese garrison of 22,000 defenders had been virtually annihilated, with fewer than 200 prisoners taken during the entire battle. The volcanic island had lived up to its reputation as a place where heroes were made and legends were born in blood. Corporal Anderson emerged from the tunnel system for the final time, his uniform caked with volcanic dust and his eyes reflecting the horrors he had witnessed in the underground war. The tunnel complex had been systematically destroyed, with marine engineers using thousands of pounds of explosives to collapse the passages and seal the entrances. The subterranean city that had housed the Japanese defenders was now a tomb, buried beneath tons of volcanic rock and concrete. Major General Rocky stood on the summit of Mount Suribachi, looking out over the island that had cost his Marines so dearly. The American flag still flew from the volcano's peak, but the victory it represented had been purchased at a price that would haunt the Marine Corps for generations. The lessons learned on Iwo Jima would influence American military doctrine for decades to come, particularly the understanding that some enemies would fight to the death rather than surrender. The medical personnel who had served throughout the battle continued their work, treating the wounded and preparing the dead for transport to the States. Navy Corpsman Bradley, who had survived the flag raising on Mount Suribachi, worked with quiet efficiency to stabilize wounded Marines for evacuation. The medical facilities on the island were overwhelmed, and ships offshore had been converted to hospital ships to handle the massive number of casualties. According to the comprehensive after-action reports compiled by Marine Corps historians, the Battle of Iwo Jima had demonstrated both the effectiveness of American military technology and the limitations of that technology when faced with a determined enemy fighting from prepared positions. The massive naval bombardment that had preceded the landing had failed to eliminate the Japanese defensive system, while the complex tunnel network had negated much of the American advantage. In firepower and mobility, the strategic importance of Iwo Jima would become apparent in the months following the battle. The island's airfields would serve as emergency landing strips for B-29 bombers, returning from raids on Japan, potentially saving hundreds of American airmen. The lessons learned during the battle would also influence American planning for the invasion of Japan, particularly the understanding that Japanese defenders would fight to the death rather than surrender. Captain Thompson, who had distinguished herself during the battle, continued to coordinate medical evacuations as the wounded were transported to hospital ships offshore. The role of women in combat, while limited by the policies of the time, had been demonstrated by the courage and dedication of medical personnel who had served under fire throughout the battle. Thompson's service would help pave the way for expanded roles for women in the military. The Marines who had survived the battle would carry the memory of Iwo Jima with them for the rest of their lives. The volcanic island had tested them in ways that no training could have prepared them for, forging bonds of brotherhood that would endure long after the war ended. The lessons learned in the volcanic sand and underground tunnels would influence a generation of Marines who would carry the Corps' traditions into future conflicts. The final ceremony on Iwo Jima was simple but profound. The surviving Marines gathered around the flag on Mount Suribachi. As a chaplain read the names of the fallen, the volcanic wind carried the words across the island, past the caves where Japanese defenders had made their final stand, past the beaches where Marines had first landed, and out to sea where the ships waited to carry the survivors home. The Battle of Iwo Jima was over, but its legacy would endure. The island had become a symbol of American determination and sacrifice, proof that free men could triumph over tyranny when the cause was just and the will to fight was strong. The volcanic sand that had claimed so many lives had also given birth to legends that would inspire future generations of Marines, reminding them that some things are worth fighting for, regardless of the cost. In the years that followed, Iwo Jima would be remembered not just as a military victory, but as a testament to the human spirit under extreme adversity. The Marines who fought there had faced death with courage, supported their comrades with loyalty, and achieved victory through sacrifice. Their story would become part of the Marine Corps' most sacred traditions, a reminder that honor, courage, and commitment are more than words. They are the foundation upon which freedom rests.